السلام عليكم.
الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وسبحان الله العلي العظيم، والحمد لله رب العالمين. نحمده ونؤمن به ونستعينه ونستهديه ونستنصره ونستجيره، فإنه حق من هدى الله فلا مضل له، ومن يضلله فلا هادي له. ونصلي ونسلم ونبارك على الحبيب المصطفى النبي الأمين محمد خاتم الرسل والأنبياء أجمعين، المرسل رحمة للعالمين، وعلى آله الأطهار الميامين، وعلى أصحابه المختارين، وعلى من اتبعوا بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. اللهم يا رب، اللهم يا عزيز يا رحمن يا رحيم، اللهم اهدنا فيمن هديت، اهدنا فيمن هديت، وعافنا فيمن عافيت، وتولنا يا الله فيمن توليت، وقنا واصرف عنا شر ما قضيت، فإنك سبحانك تقضي ولا يقضى عليك، وإنه يا رب لا يذل من واليت ولا يعز من عاديت، تباركت ربنا وتعاليت. نستغفرك الله ونتوب إليك، ونؤمن بك ونتوكل عليك، ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله، عليه توكلنا وإليه أنبنا، ولله المصير. Subhanallah, Allah is in constant communication with His ibad, with Allah's ibad. Allah is in constant communication through the very sunnah of creation. That indeed so much of what surrounds us in life is but a thinly veiled medium through which the divine communicates with us, reminding us, instructing us. This past week, yet another one of life's reminders that makes one pause and think of a most I don't even know how to describe it, except that the marvel of one's lifespan itself merits so much pause and so much reflection. This past week, a friend of ours, a very beautiful, kind woman, she must be around my age, perhaps younger, woman called Nahid Ansari, married to an old friend, Levent Akbarut, a mother and wife. This past week, she passed away in Los Angeles. And like every time that Allah teaches us through the very sunnah of creation, through the numerous things that take place in our universe, that constantly alerts our attention and say, thus is your Maker's will, thus is your Maker's way, thus is the path. Nahid Ansari passing away yet again makes one pause. It seemed just like yesterday. It is hard to believe that it was decades ago. It seems but yesterday when I was first introduced to this woman as Levent Akbarut's bride. I was immediately struck by this woman's aura, an aura of piety, an aura of kindness, an aura of gentleness. And back then, it was truly difficult to imagine how quickly the years will pass and how quickly the person that I had just met seemed introduced to as the wife of a friend already is done with this journey, the journey of life. And it made me pause to think of all the ways that that life could have been more meaningful in my own existence, of the missed opportunities, of the missed chances, of the missed blessings. Could we have gotten to know this family better? Could we have spent more time with this family? More importantly, knowing what the potential of this woman was and the potential of her husband, and which I don't doubt the potential of the children she gave birth to and she raised. Could we have collaborated? Could we have joined as Muslim brothers and sisters and served this ummah better? Why is it that time and time again we let life come over us like a deluge, a virtual deluge, an unstoppable flood of raging waves, and we only control life in retrospect, largely through the medium of regret and missed chances? And of course, every mortality of any person you've known is but a warning to you, a direct warning. If Nahid's time is today or yesterday, it will be but a few minutes before it is my time. And when I leave, what have I left behind? Then a most worrisome thought came over me. The world as I knew it, as I expected it, as I foresaw it, what I contemplated of this world, what I expected to come of this world, what I foresaw would be the major developments in our world, back then, some 30 years ago or more, when these relationships with people, these relationships that are now in the phase of phasing out, when you reach the stage of life where relationships that once were very fresh, once were in their beginning stages, in fact, you realize that whether you like it or not, you are reaching the concluding chapters, if not the concluding paragraphs of the narrative of your story. Once we were very young Muslims. Once every relationship we encountered would be somehow interrelated and interconnected and intermingled with what we expected from this world and what we expected to do with our world. The frightening thought is, as my sister Nahid left last week, and I am sure I will leave myself soon after, how have we left the world that once seemed like it is but in the palm of our hands, ready for the taking, and ready to be shaped by our own impact? When I look back as human beings, as Muslims, as parents, how are we leaving this world? What has been our experience as Muslims in this world? How have we shaped this world? And how has it shaped us? SubhanAllah, when you reflect upon your lifespan and you reflect upon your relationships, and then at the very same time, as you lend your ear to the sunnah of creation and the way that Allah constantly talks to us, and you are reminded of a reality in that very same week that the United Nations, the body which has been the most impactful in terms of articulating visions of modern day human rights, every advancement we made in the discourses on human rights took place through the medium of the United Nations. The United Nations, with all its paradoxes and all its contradictions, yet this has been the institutional medium in which the Universal Declaration for Human Rights was articulated in 1948, in which the Covenant on Political and Civil Rights was passed, and the Covenant on Economic and Cultural Rights were passed. This is the institutional medium where all discourses about the morality of the world in which we live has taken place. But this same institution, in the same week in which I pause and have long, sanguine, contemplative moments about one's own life, this same institution, for the first time since the creation of something called the World Food Program, the WFP, the World Food Program sent a message to hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, telling them that the World Food Program, starting next month, can no longer afford providing them with food vouchers. You see, the unemployment rate among Palestinians is about 50%. Gaza is a huge concentration camp, surrounded by land, sea, and air. The unemployment rate in Gaza is much higher than 50%. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians have no method for gainful employment. And the way they stay alive is through the WFP, the World Food Program. The World Food Program provides hundreds of thousands of Palestinians with food vouchers every month. The food voucher comes out to about $110, $108, $110. And that food voucher, worth $100+ is the way the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians managed to stay alive despite the unemployment, the absolute lack of mobility, social mobility or economic mobility, absolute lack of opportunities, the concentration camp-like structure in which Israel has imposed upon Palestinians. It is the food voucher program that keeps all these Palestinians fed. Well, the World Food Program notified hundreds of thousands of Palestinians just this last week that it has ran out of money and that it can no longer provide them with food vouchers. The World Food Program urgently needs $51 million to continue feeding Palestinians. No one has stepped forward to provide the World Food Program with $51 million, and as a result, by failing to provide these food vouchers, the only choice left for these Palestinian families is to starve to death. For instance, There's a story that was reported on Al Jazeera about one Palestinian family, just one such Palestinian family in Gaza. The mother is a college graduate, has a degree in history. The father is a college graduate and has a degree in psychology. Both father and mother are unemployed, with absolutely no economic chances anywhere. In order to work, they need the Israeli authorities to provide them with a work permit. But the only way to get a work permit is to pay for it, because work permits are lucrative commodities and they're very expensive. And even if you generate the cash to buy a work permit to work in Israel, go through all the security points, all the screening, all the misery, part of your salary will be kept by the agent that brought you the work permit. Well, most Palestinian families, like this one, can't afford to get the work permit. Or even if they can afford, Israel limits the number of work permits that may be given to Palestinians. And so work permit is not available. And this woman, Aisha, the historian, and her husband, the psychologist, have 7 children. And they've been keeping their 7 children alive on the food vouchers provided by that UN program. The same week they received notice that food vouchers will no longer be available starting next month. That same week, for reasons that they don't understand and no one knows, Israelis bombed their home in Gaza and destroyed it. So now, not only are they unemployed, not only don't they have food vouchers, but they're also homeless. Mother and father and 7 children. Stories like this are breaking out in the hundreds. Story after story after story. I pause and I think, I talk back to this young Khalid that used to hang out with the young Levent Akbarut, Nahid's husband, used to hang out in cafeterias talking about the Ummah and the future of the Ummah. I think back to that young Khalid who and as I received that message, Khalid, your life is nearly up. And it will be very soon before you say farewell. Could you have imagined a world that would yet to come in which not only is the sanctity of Al-Aqsa violated every week, with the utter silence and complicity of Muslims, but a world in which Palestinians are kept in a concentration camp, not just by the Israelis, but by their fellow Muslim, Arab Egyptians. Because let's not forget, the concentration camp in Gaza is not just maintained by the Israelis, it is also by the Egyptians. Could you have imagined a world in which the Human Rights Council in the UN is more active than ever, in which the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights that works under the auspices of the Secretary General and the Human Rights Council is more active than ever? A world that claims to have advanced in human rights because it is determined to abolish the death penalty, for instance. But at the same time, a world that is fully aware of hundreds of thousands and millions of Muslims dying all over. But in this world, with the utter complicity and silence of fellow Muslims, could you have imagined a world in which Palestinians are about to starve to death because they need $50 million, at the same time that the country that has designated itself as the servant of the two holy shrines pays a soccer player $400 or $500 million? How many multi-millionaire Muslims have this $50 million in their bank account? And yet, even if they wanted to donate the money to Palestinians, they wouldn't do it. And they wouldn't do it because we live in a world in which the balance of powers have become that any Muslim that wants to help a fellow Muslim must think 100 times before they do so, because they are terrified of being labeled a supporter of terrorism. A world in which human rights discourses have reached unprecedented levels, more than any time in history. But at the same moment, a world that terrorizes Muslims into utter complacency and silence. That even if you had the money, you would be scared to extend any type of serious, significant assistance because you are worried about being labeled a supporter of terrorism. And the conscience of the world doesn't seem bothered. There isn't a flurry of activity to come up with the $50 million. The message sent to Palestinians telling them that starting next month, no more food vouchers, what came after extensive efforts by the World Food Program to raise the $50 million. They've knocked at every door. They've knocked at American doors, Swiss doors, Canadian doors, Saudi doors, Emirati doors, Indonesian doors, Turkish doors. They couldn't come up with the sum. Now, This world where at the same time there is a financial conglomerate called the Adani Group. This is the same group that is involved, that signed the contract with Saudi to manage a part of the Hajj, etc., etc. The Adani Group is not just an Indian group, but the owners of the Adani investment group are followers of the Hindutva ideology. They're Hindu nationalists. Now, among the things the Adani Group did is that it developed a complex economic relationship with Israel. In fact, they just invested $1.2 billion in the Israeli economy by buying part of the Haifa port. This Hindu nationalist economic organization didn't just invest money in Israel, but they also invested money in importing technology from Israel, a very particular type of technology, often referred to as occupation technology. The Indians are so impressed by the way Israelis control Palestinians, deny them all rights, maintain them as subjugated and thoroughly dominated human beings, no better than animals in a barn. They are so impressed by this that they bought the technology and information to allow the Indian government to implement the same strategies of control and dominance that the Israelis implement against Palestinians, to import these methods and tools of control to Kashmir, so that they can control Muslims in Kashmir the way Israelis control Palestinians. But get this. The Adani Group, part of their contract with the Israeli government, is now, they've signed with the Netanyahu government a deal by which Israel will import 34,000 laborers to work in the construction industry. Now, all the Palestinians, the vast majority of Palestinians who are given work permits to work in Israel, work in the construction industry. So yes, you get the picture. So now the Indians are going to be exporting skilled laborers in the construction field, 34,000, to Israel, meaning these Indian workers are going to replace Palestinian workers. Israel, finding that it can get away with its apartheid system, that the world of human rights apparently don't apply to Israel, Their apartheid system is so effective that they say, why do we need Palestinian workers? Let's replace Palestinian workers with Indian workers. So no food vouchers. Their jobs are being taken by now Indian workers, bigger unemployment for Palestinians. But what blows your mind is when you discover that the Adani Group and the investment in the Haifa port and all the economic relations between the Indian government and the Israeli government is all blessed and greatly encouraged by the American government. Why is that? Because, as by the way, President Biden's top national security advisor just last month was meeting with Saudi officials to make sure that the American plan for a vast infrastructure that would connect the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries, and the Gulf countries to India via shipping lanes and railway. And that this is part of an American, Israeli, Indian, Saudi economic plan to develop ports in Haifa and elsewhere to create this economic infrastructure between Arabia to India that maximizes profits that will go in Israeli pockets, in Indian pockets, in Saudi pockets, in American pockets. And of course, the United Arab Emirates, because they're a huge part of this plan. So then you pause. Palestinians have run out of food. The UN can't get $50 million to feed Palestinians. There's an economic plan that involves the Saudis and Emiratis and Americans. Part of this plan is to import technology into India to better control Muslims in Kashmir, to implement an apartheid regime against Muslims in India, as there is an apartheid regime against Muslims in Israel. And that's okay, because as long as economic relations between the Emirates, Saudi, India, and Israel is developed so that already extremely rich people can get even richer and richer. And part of that plan is to replace Palestinian labor with Indian labor. And you pause. And you say, think back, Khalid, to the early 80s. Think back to the jokes, to the smiles, to the hopeful dreams, to the aspirations. Think back to the youth and the youth of those now who you see are growing old with you and passing away. Could you have imagined? What world have I encountered? And what world am I leaving behind? You see, the issue is not to blame anyone. The real issue is simply to ask, could I have done it better? Could I have done it better? How did we get in this situation? And what is my lack of contribution that contributed to this situation? At the same time, United States, part of the American plan for the region, thoroughly depends on the cooperation of the Saudis and the Emiratis. Part of the Indian plan for its economy thoroughly depends on the cooperation of the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Americans and the Israelis. We live in a world in which Muslim states could theoretically say it is unacceptable that Palestinians would starve to death or that you would run out of food vouchers. We live in a world that theoretically, Muslims could put their foot down and say, you can't implement an apartheid regime against Muslims in Kashmir. We will not allow it. We live in a world, theoretically, where Muslims could say, we will not allow you to import or to have, if you're going to sign a deal to import Indian workers to replace Palestinian workers, then you can't count on our cooperation, and we're putting our foot down. We could, but we don't live in such a world. We don't live in such world. We live in a world in which Muslims have become so marginalized, so exoticized, so projected as the other, so much so that they are out of the stream of human rights discourses. If you put someone to death in Europe, that gets the attention of the entire human rights world. But life and death in the Muslim world are more or less the same. How many Muslims you exploit, how many Muslims you inflict suffering on, how many Muslims you dominate or brutalize, hardly gets any attention in the world that we live in. All the world knows that long before the genocide against the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, for years, human rights activists were warning that a genocide is coming. Same thing as in India now. It's just that Muslims are oblivious. It's just that the same Muslims who will make the biggest spiel if they see a woman speaking without hijab, the same Muslims who will elect a government that bans Muslims just because this government tells them what they want to hear about homosexuality. These same Muslims, for years, everyone was warning what the nationalist Confucian government in Myanmar, because they passed number of anti-Muslim citizenship laws, exactly like India did. Twitter and Facebook was full of anti-Muslim rhetoric for years before the genocide against the Rohingyas. Muslims in their masajid, in their Islamic centers, continue to talk about the stuff they talk about. Allah knows what they talk about. Taqwa, sincerity, whatever nonsense they talk about. And they completely, until the genocide took place, and thousands of lives lost later, thousands upon thousands of rapes of Muslim women, here we stand, another genocide about to take place in India, with the full cooperation of Israel and the full complicity of the United States and the full complicity of Saudi and the full complicity of the Emirat. Israel just passed a law that tightens controls on Palestinian schools and the licensing of Palestinian schools to make sure that not only will be Palestinians unable to feed their children, but even giving their children a religious education or teaching their children Arabic instead of Hebrew will become a bigger and bigger problem. And as to the majority of Muslims in the world, oblivious as always. Same week, we have all been following, in the typical way we follow, the genocide against the Uyghur Muslims in China. This same past week, this week of reflection and contemplation, China is now focused on the Uyghur Muslims. In the Yunnan province, China has started tearing down the mosques of the Uyghur ethnic group, banning the minarets and the domes. And if they don't destroy the mosque, they at least destroy the minaret and the dome of the mosque to, quote unquote, make the mosque more consistent with Chinese architecture. But the same steps of escalation where the Uyghur Muslims were forced into re-education camps, into brainwashing camps, into concentration camps where they were raped, brutalized, beaten. The same steps of escalation now are taking place against the Uyghur Muslims in the Yunnan province. China knows very well that Muslims don't care. China knows very well that even when non-Muslims protest, the United States or Europe, it's all just verbal. They just condemn it in the hallways of the United Nations. But there are no economic consequences. There are no real consequences to oppressing Muslims and to erasing the identity and character of Muslims. There are no consequences to erasing Muslims, bottom line. All that's going to happen, and I'm sure the number of Muslims in the world that have done this will probably not even count on one hand. The Human Rights Council, among the things that nations of the world have to do is they have to submit a human rights report every few years to the Human Rights Council. In that report, they discuss their compliance with human rights issues. The Human Rights Council then writes a comment on this report, either saying good job or saying thumbs down, you're a human rights violator, you're a bad guy. Well, China submitted its most recent report just this last year. And the Human Rights Council's response to China's report was extremely disappointing. They didn't take China to task, even worse than previous years. It's as if the Human Rights Council got the point. No one cares. And so they did not take China to task about their genocide. And shortly after that, China started escalating steps against the Uyghur Muslims. It's like, oh, the world really doesn't care. Okay, well, let's do it now to the Uyghur Muslims. I think back to the Khalid that was meeting those who will become the main characters in his lifetime. And I realize that from a Muslim point of view, I leave this world much worse than I found it in the 80s. And in this sense, my life has been a total failure. Moral responsibility demands that I contemplate and think very carefully about how I will explain the way I found the world, the way I engage the world, and the way I am leaving the world to my children. Because what I say and how I say it might make the difference between children that will be committed to the same causes that I was committed to my entire lifetime, or children who give up on the causes that I have pursued during my lifetime. It behooves us all to think very carefully about what we tell our children about the world, the way we found it, and the way the world is as we leave it. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم أسأل الله يستجب لكم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والحمد لله رب العالمين وسبحان الله العلي العظيم. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه يا رب العالمين. After the prayer, inshallah, we'll do Salat al-Janaza in absentia for our sister Nahid Ansari. Salat al-Janaza is 4 takbirat. After the first takbirah, after when we say Allahu Akbar the first time, you read al-Fatiha. And then the second takbirah, when we say Allahu Akbar the second time, you read the second half of الصلاة الإبراهيمية, which is اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم وبارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما باركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم في العالمين إنك حميد مجيد. So this is after a second takbirah. after the third takbirah, you do a dua for the deceased. You do a dua for our sister, Nahid al-Sari. And after the fourth takbirah, you do a more general dua for all Muslims and all those who pass away into Allah's care. There are two other things well, let me focus on one, because even if we think that the Muslim voice is somehow muted when it comes to an apartheid regime against Palestinians, or the Muslim voice is muted when it comes to a genocide against Muslims in India, or against Muslims in Myanmar, or the Muslim voice is muted when it comes to a genocide against Muslims in China. Even if we say that it is too ambitious and too fantastical to expect Muslim consciousness to react to the world at large by saying, if we make it our business to protect our fellow Muslims around the world. But even closer at home, last khutbah, I talked about an incident in which a young Muslim student named Fatima at City University of New York School of Law. If you remember, at graduation, Fatima's colleagues, her class, elected her to speak at the graduation. And in this graduation speech, she mentioned the suffering of the Palestinian people and the systematic human rights committed against the Palestinian people. And the law school reacted by removing Fatima's graduation speech from all its sites, in other words, censoring her speech. But things escalated this past week further, in that the law school not just removed the speech, but apologized for the speech and described the speech as anti-Semitic. The mayor of New York stepped in, describing the speech of this law student as anti-Semitic, and in fact saying that if he was there, he would have stood up and interrupted the speech and not allowed it to continue. At the same time, as I noted last week, a number of Jewish organizations objected to the smear campaign being launched against this young law student. And a number of faculty signed a letter objecting to the way that the university has treated Fatima by censoring her speech. Now, this is not just some minor incident. This has to do with the way we Muslims relate to the very concept of human rights. Because the way human rights is an evolving animal. Human rights don't come down from the heavens. Human rights are defined by human institutions. And these human institutions are constantly evolving and restructuring and reformulating. They are not constant. And they are, to put it simply, the universalistic ideology of our age. People no longer talk about the righteousness of believing in God, or the righteousness of the church, or the righteousness of Jesus. People talk about the righteousness of human rights, so that even those who violate human rights speak the language of human rights. So it's not that China says, I don't believe in human rights. China claims that it honors and respects human rights more than the US does. Same thing with Russia. Same thing with North Korea. Human rights have become the secular religion of our age. But the way this secular religion is being shaped and weaponized, it is systematically to the exclusion of Muslims and Muslim causes. So, it is not your human right, the way this discourse has shaped, to protest or object or otherwise prevent insults directed at your prophet, even the most grotesque and pornographic insults. But it is your human right to censor, protest, and object to discourse that would be otherwise considered objectionable because it is anti-Semitic or racist. These are value choices. These are morality choices as to what you consider to be sacrosanct or not sacrosanct. The current battle being fought at so many levels is a systematic push to say, if you expose the obscenities of Israeli conduct against Palestinians, if you say Israel is an apartheid state, if you say Israel is a systematic violator of human rights, then you are anti-Semite. But there are a lot of people paying very close attention because they plan to borrow from that playbook. Mark my words, soon it will be that the Hindu nationalists who actually believe in their cause and actually, unlike Muslims, spend millions of dollars supporting people who dedicate their entire life to serving the Hindu cause. Hindus are going to borrow from this playbook, and they're going to structure the discourse of human rights so that if you attempt to deny the Hindu identity of India, or criticize Hindu nationalism, or say that India is an apartheid state because of what it does to Muslims in India, you will be marked as a racist against the Indian people. and as a bigot against Hindu values. We are already seeing China working diligently to silence criticism as to what it's doing to the Uyghur and now Hui people, by saying that those who are criticizing China for its conduct towards the Uyghurs are in fact as racist as those who passed the Chinese exclusion laws some 100 years ago in the United States. It's as if your problem is not that you actually care about the rights of Muslims in China, but that you are ethnically a hater of Chinese ethnicity. And where are Muslims as the ideology that rules the universe is being shaped and crafted and directed and weaponized? Oh, they're busy spending $500 million on a soccer player. They're busy building a new Kaaba in Riyadh. They're busy, I don't know. You couldn't get Muslims to sign a letter about racism. You couldn't get Muslims to sign a letter about police brutality. You couldn't get Muslims to sign a letter about slavery. You couldn't get Muslims to sign a letter about Jerusalem. You couldn't get Muslims to sign the letter about the obscenities that are taking place in the lands of the Prophet ﷺ. A woman just got sentenced to 30 years in prison for a bunch of tweets about unemployment, criticizing the lack of jobs in Saudi Arabia. No. But it comes to something like sexual mores and all these imams rush to sign a letter. We are so marginal to the world. It is sad. Once upon a time, when I was a youth, when I first met this beautiful lady, Nahid Ansari, I really thought, naively, that we Muslims are going to be at the center of the world. That by the time I am ready to meet my God, and I thought that by the time I reach this stage in life, I thought we would be in a very different world. I pray that our children will be far better and far more successful than we have been in impacting and shaping the world that they will leave behind. Don't forget, after we pray, then we'll do janazah prayer right away. Allahumma ighfir lana, Allahumma afu anna, Allahumma arhamna, Allahumma tub alayna ya tawwab ya rabbal alameen. Allah forgive our sins. Allah forgive our relapses, our oversights. Allah forgive our weakness and our inabilities and our failures. Allah enable us to convincingly explain our lives to those who follow us, so that they may still look up to us and respect us and honor our legacy. Ya Rabbal Alameen. وصلي وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه وأقم الصلاة.